There are many, many people that would not step foot on someone's farm or ranch, but they will step foot on a fairgrounds.
State and county fairs have long been a bridge between rural and urban, but as our society drifts further from production agriculture, that bridge is under pressure financially, culturally, and politically. From rising costs to volunteer burnout, lack of participation to being a political football. So, how do we refocus? How do we, in the ag industry, protect these events that tell our story?
If they're not talking about the impact they're having, and again, it doesn't have to be financially huge, then how can they expect to remain relevant or top of mind for those officials?
Today, Jeremy Parsons from the Iowa State Fair and Taylor Pulford with the State Fair of Texas join me as we discuss what's the future of our county and state fairs and what's our role in making sure they can continue for future generations. That's on this episode of the Working Ranch Radio Show. Hi, everyone. Welcome. This is the Working Ranch Radio Show. I'm Justin Mills, your host. Glad to have you tune in and joining us on our program today as we talk about the relevance and supporting our county and state fairs and why that is important to the future of our industry. So tune in. We'll get to that in just a few moments. However, for those of you that are, this may be your first time or first couple of times listening to the Working Ranch Radio Show, well, we welcome you and we hope you enjoy our program here today. And if you haven't been able to listen to all of our previous shows, we've been around a few years, so we've got quite a library of shows. You can find our programs at any podcast provider that you have or you like or you use, or you can go to our site at workingranchradio.com. And by the way, leave us comments, reviews as well. That's helpful not only for us, but for other folks that might be searching through the libraries and want to hear something that made a lot of sense to you, might make a lot of sense to somebody else as well. Don't forget to tune in later on in the show. Meteorologist Don Day will be in as we'll take a look at that long-term weather and what he is seeing for weather as we look into the month of August. Well, before we get too far here today into our program, I did want to make one mention here. And that is the recent passing of a good friend of ours here at the Working Ranch Radio Show, someone that's been a huge advocate on behalf of the U.S. cattle industry for many, many years. Leah Biondo, who passed away back on the 24th of July, but she was doing what she loved most, and that was riding horses with her friends. She was in Montana at the time. Leah spent many years working on behalf of the cattle industry with the U.S. Cattlemen's Association, both as the Director of Federal Policy and then later as the Executive Vice President. Well, I'll tell you what, she's going to be a huge void to try to fill for our industry that fights on behalf of the U.S. cattle industry. On behalf of the Working Ranch Radio Show, the Working Ranch Magazine, our hearts, thoughts, and prayers go out to the family and friends of Leah Biondo. Back after this.
Our mothers prayed we'd find our way, and our hearts would fly through heaven's gate.
It all starts with a tag. Identifying each animal allows you to better manage the entire herd and control your operation's future. For nearly 70 years, producers have chosen Allflex for individual animal management. With Allflex, you get the most trusted portfolio of ID solutions. Whether you need stock or custom visual tags, electronic tags, tissue sampling units for DNA collection, or syringes, bring the Allflex advantage to your operation today. Visit allflexusa.com to learn more.
Welcome back to the Working Ranch Radio Show. As our overarching topic and theme here today is looking at the future of our state fair and county fairs all across the country. It seems as though they've kind of been a little bit on the chopping block from time to time here as late. We're going to talk about that here today. It was back in 1841 when Syracuse, New York held the first state fair. And since that time, about every state across the country has put together some version of their own state fair. Now, not every state has a state fair, but most do. And especially in even states that do have a lot of agricultural base to them in one form or the other. Today, we have with us guests from two different state fairs that have a long history. Jeremy Parsons is the CEO and the manager of the Iowa State Fair, a fair that began in 1854, and Taylor Pulfer is joining us here today. She is the Director of Communications for the State Fair of Texas, a fair that began back in 1886. And Jeremy, Taylor, good to have you here today on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Thanks for having us. Excited to be here.
Yes, and looking forward to the conversation.
You bet. Well, as all of us were talking before we started here today, I was kind of laying out to you where the concept of this show stemmed from. And me having a background in fair and rodeo management several years ago, and you guys in it now, I just feel like that our agricultural folks need to be aware of where we're at with our state fairs, and more probably even maybe a little bit more pointed to our county fairs as we continue to see maybe a little bit more pressure put on them. And I want to start and kind of maybe lay a little background. And Jeremy, I'm going to go with you first on this. And of course, Iowa State Fair has a long history. Well, both your guys' fairs have a long history of their role in agriculture in your respective states. And Jeremy, from your perspective, as you look back over the history of the Iowa State Fair, describe the role it played to not only the state, but to the ag industry as well.
Yeah, obviously fairs were established as a place specifically for farmers, for rural people to get together and not only celebrate, but also educate and compete. All three of those were major components. Now, those are still the cornerstones of what we do here at the Iowa State Fair 171 years later, but it has evolved, and we've added this fourth piece of really education for those not involved in agriculture. And that's our mission. As I sit here in my office looking at our mission statement now, it is to celebrate Iowa's agricultural heritage. So that's really what we're about. And that celebration in today's world, though, is more than a livestock show. It is also educating people about that livestock and what the rural way of life means. And so that's really why we exist still.
Yeah, you bet. Taylor, I want to go to you, and of course, as representing the State Fair of Texas. And, when I lined you guys up as our guests, I couldn't get everybody in the country to come on and kind of give a little spiel about the fairs and respective for their particular areas or regions. And so I chose a couple of you guys and basically fairs that are, Iowa State Fair. I mean, it's one of the longest fairs going on in the country. State Fair of Texas, Taylor, you guys down there have a long heritage as well. And as I asked Jeremy about what their role back when they started was to their respective state into agriculture, how have you guys evolved over the years to what you are today and your role to the agricultural industry?
So a lot of what Jeremy was talking about is so similar for us here at the State Fair of Texas. We also started as an agriculture exposition, a way for folks to share best practices and come together and have that sense of community. So we started there, and we've really kept that as part of our roots as we've evolved over the years, now celebrating 139 years of the State Fair of Texas. We still have agriculture as one of those components of our mission. We also celebrate agriculture, education, and community involvement. And like Jeremy said, a big piece of it to us is not only how do we bring in everyone who is in that agriculture space already, but how do we also educate those folks who are from the heart of Dallas, where our fair is hosted, and help them understand that agriculture plays a role in so many different parts of their lives where they might not have ever realized. There are kids just a stone's throw away from Fair Park who have never seen an animal up close and personal. And so to provide those experiences is critical for our organization in the future of agriculture.
You bet. As you both hit on the fact that where it's evolved to, education being a big component of that. If you look back to when your fairs first started, I would say majority of the people coming to your fairs were very well aware of where their food came from. Would you agree on that?
Absolutely.
You most definitely.
And today, it's just almost just the opposite of that. And so I respect that element. Let's move down to one level, because let's go down to our county fair element. And while I realize the same components were there and that it's a showcase early on when they were evolving or when they were starting up to where we are today, that still thing is relevant. It's becoming tougher at the county level, though, isn't it?
Well, I think for sure it's an issue of resources. Before coming here to the Iowa State Fair, I spent 12 years as a CEO of the Clay County Fair in Spencer, Iowa, which is one of the largest farm machinery shows in the country, let alone at a fair. And so exactly what you're talking about, even at a place like that in rural America, only about 50% of our audience were on the farm. You know, it's all about resources. And I know for many of our county fairs, especially in rural Iowa, rural America, the number one resource that is depleting is people. And as population loss occurs, that affects your 4-H and FFA participation numbers. That affects your number of sponsors in terms of local businesses, you know, so it really is a challenge. I know, especially for fairs in rural Iowa, that they're facing.
Yeah. Taylor, I want to go to you, kind of the similar question. And like I had told you guys when we were emailing back and forth, I know running a state fair is a lot different than a county fair. I get that. But at the same time, you guys do rub shoulders with these folks that are doing county fairs in your respective states or other states if you're in associations membership. So from your perspective, Taylor, what do you see with that as we drop down to the county level and just kind of its role and what we're seeing with that?
I think one of the things from my perspective that stands out is just what it takes to put on an event in this day and age. Expenses are constantly climbing, and it feels even as a state fair, we're struggling to keep up. So I can't imagine how county fairs feel when it comes to the rising costs of safety and security and the food expenses and just employee wages. Everything plays a role in ultimately the success of hosting an event. But at the end of the day, we have to be able to make some sort of profit to then be able to support that mission. So I see that as a huge challenge for not only state fairs, but also county fairs.
Yeah.
And Justin, just kind of jump in there. You know, I think every state, there is a deep relationship between their county fairs and the state fair. You know, I know for us here in Iowa, it even goes so far as the Iowa State Fair Board is elected by the county fairs of Iowa. Iowa State Fair Board members are not appointed by a governor. They are actually elected by county fair people, and they all are county fair people. And so, you know, there's a huge connection there. So as Taylor mentioned, I always say the difference between a county fair, state fair, doesn't matter where you are, is really just the zeros at the end. What I mean by that are the number of attendees, whether it's 1,000 people or 1 million, or whether your budget is $4,000 or $40 million. Ultimately, those fairgoers have the exact same expectation. And to Taylor's point, in today's world, it's hard to make the books balance for sure sometimes.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right, guys, let's take a break here. When we come back, I want to continue to go a little bit deeper into some of these pressure points that we're talking about. We touched on them a little bit. Definitely budget is, it's the first thing that comes to the top. It really does. And I think that's really the case in any of those. That's going to be that. We're going to continue to talk about some other things. We'll do that when we come back here after the break. This segment today brought to you by the American Gelbvieh Association. Meet modern industry demands for feedlots and carcass traits with Gelbvieh and Balancer Genetics. Find out more at gelbvieh.org.
Capitalize on crossbreeding with Gelbvieh and Balancer bulls. Raise replacement females with added fertility, increased longevity, and greater productivity. Gelbvieh and Balancer influence females wean more pounds of calf per cow exposed. In the feed yard, Balancer influenced cattle offer increased performance, improved feed efficiency, and have excellent carcass merit. Balancers add the pounds, make the grade, and deliver the value. This year, make your crossbreeding count with Gelbvieh and Balancer Genetics.
Welcome back as we continue on here our program today. We're really looking at just the whole concept of how do we understand from our industry. And when I say our industry, I'm talking to mainly us in agriculture, understanding the importance and the relevance that our county and state fairs plays to us, and also how we can protect that as we move forward. We're finding in that industry, it's becoming tougher and tougher. Joining me here on the program today is Jeremy Parsons, who is the CEO and manager of the Iowa State Fair, and Taylor Pulfer, who's the director of communications for the State Fair of Texas. In the last segment, we started kind of dipping into a little bit of the things that are pressure points that we're seeing in your particular fair industry. As we were saying, money seems to always come to the top, and there's always pressure there. A lot of these fairs, as we know, are funded the entities as much as they can try to find outside dollars, but at the same time, it still takes state monies or county monies to continue to help make them go on. And that continues to be one of the pressure points. When we look at funding from that standpoint, that's got to be really one of the toughest things. It seems like you're always having to battle. From a state fair perspective, it's probably state legislature. From a county fair, it's both. It's your state legislature regarding some tax implications, as well as county commissioners and their decisions on how they spend those tax dollars.
Yeah, I think it's always interesting. I think usually, and one of the things we hang our hats on in the fair industry is the fact that we're affordable family entertainment. You can still come to the Iowa State Fair for a day that, quite frankly, is cheaper than going to a 2-hour movie, and you can spend all day here. But with that, then I think fairs are pretty conscious from a revenue perspective to make sure they're not outpricing the market. On the flip side, though, expenses continue to rise. And so as our culture and society continues to shift, I know for us here at the Iowa State Fair, and even talking to some smaller county fairs in Iowa that are going on right now, the safety and security piece is an escalating cost. Unfortunately, in today's world, people like to gather at fairs to not learn about agriculture. They're there to maybe be destructive or cause problems. And you have to be protecting your fairgoers from that. And so I think really adding to that pressure, and that really kind of speaks to what you were just talking about, Justin, because for many county fairs, and even for us at the state fair, that then involves your local sheriff's department, your state patrol, your state police. And so it really does require a partnership, but that partnership is not cheap.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Taylor, same question basically to you from the funding standpoint, the challenge that's there, that's whether it's a county fair or state fair?
Yeah, first, I completely agree, Jeremy. Last year alone, we spent nearly $7 million on safety and security, where a decade ago, I don't even think we were spending $1 million. And so that increase is just astronomical, but it is ultimately the most important piece of our event and our organization to make sure we're keeping folks safe and keeping that family-friendly experience. So that's been a tough thing for us. And we're kind of a unique beast in the sense of we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. And so we're not funded by any state funding at all. And that's not to say that we're immune from working with the government. We definitely have government relations is a huge piece of my job that we're constantly working with them. But as far as funding goes, we're really, really dependent on the success of our 24-day event. And so, as you can imagine, a lot goes into that, making sure that the fair stays safe for those 24 days, making sure the weather cooperates, which we unfortunately have no control over. But that's how we ultimately raise our funds to then sustain us for the rest of the year. And then throw in the fact that we're trying to fundraise for all of our nonprofit initiatives throughout the year in the community. It is definitely a challenge. I will say we continue to have to get creative in making sure that we are raising enough funds to be not just a big neighbor, but a helpful neighbor to all of our folks in our community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I want to get into one more. We're going to come. There's some things that both Jeremy and Taylor said that I raised some questions I will get to later on. I want to come back to those, but I want to continue to work through some of the things that I think continue to be pressure points. And one of the things that we talked about before we went on air here today, and that is the fact, and I've said this, I felt like this same way several years ago when I was in the industry, and at that time I was using the phrase that we are, one generation away from Grandma and Grandpa's farm, and we're further than that. And as we continue to see our society get further and further away from the farm, and you both mentioned that the part of your role you feel in fairs is to educate people. I get that. But that also, just the fact that we are continuing to get further and further removed away from production agriculture is a challenge. Jeremy.
It is a challenge. And this is where I'm probably going to say a very controversial statement.
Okay.
What we have discovered here at the Iowa State Fair, and even my time at the Clay County Fair and even various county fairs, is there are two groups of people attending the fair from an agricultural perspective. You have the livestock exhibitor, who is there to compete and enjoy that experience. And there is the fair goer. And the fair goer is there to learn about agriculture. But sometimes the livestock exhibitor group is not interested in educating the fairgoers about agriculture. In fact, can be somewhat hostile to that mom pushing her stroller through the barn, not knowing what she's seeing. And so that really, I think, is a challenge going forward to really make sure, are we all on the same page in terms of educating people about agriculture? I know for many people, from a livestock show perspective, they would wish the general public were not there, if truth be told. And that really then becomes part of the disconnect of, is everybody on the same page? There's a great example from a county fair I think of where you walk up to the show ring and it's surrounded by people in their lawn chairs, family of the kids exhibiting. And so if you're a general fairgoer person, you don't feel like you can watch what's going on because it seems like a private event. And with that, you're probably going to kick me off the show, Justin, but that really is a reality. You know, the importance of herdsmanship that is failing at some fairs as well. You need to keep your pens, your area neat and tidy because the public are looking at it. It could be a challenge for sure.
I'm not going to kick you off, Jeremy, because we're going to go into that a little bit further. Taylor, I want you to answer the same question in just that disconnect as we continue to be further and further away from production agriculture, the challenge there.
Yeah, I mean, to add on to what Jeremy was saying, we definitely see that in our fair as well. And so I think a way that we've tried to kind of marry the two different audiences is having those a little bit more fairgoer facing agriculture exhibits, whether it be our birthing barn, where we actually have staff there to then educate about the process of each animal giving birth. And you might even get to witness a live birth, which, as someone who didn't grow up in that agriculture space, that you can then feel like you're learning and engaging and maybe not necessarily walking into that auction and feeling like an outsider or walking through those barns and feeling like you're not welcome there. And I don't want to say that's always the case, but we've found success with hosting these other exhibits throughout the fairgrounds to kind of marry the two.
Yeah. Okay, Jeremy, I want to go a little bit further into something you said. As you said, well, now you might kick me off the show here because you kind of made a comment there that some folks that are in the agriculture side of things may not like to hear, but they do need to hear that. You know, from the livestock show perspective, is that they like to have their own little secluded show. But if people aren't coming there, that's what's paying the bills so that barn can be open so that we can have this livestock show. And I think the realization from our folks in our industry to be aware of that. And I believe your guys' initial statement in segment 1 that we're here for an educational purpose, that's the biggest thing. So I do not disagree, Jeremy, with what you said, and I would say, you know, we've got to continue to preach that.
Well, you know, looking from a historical perspective, the reason why fairs are doing rides and concerts and food and all of those types of things is twofold. One, it's to draw people in, and two, it's to generate the revenue needed to be able to fulfill our mission, which is agricultural competitions and education. And so sometimes there's a resentment there, but as I often reminded people I was at the Clay County Fair in Spencer, that check the carnival leaves us when they leave town is what's paying your premiums. Mm-hmm. And so that, you know, it really has to be together. So there has to be some give and take. And to Taylor's point, you know, we've done some similar programs here to really marry the two. And we've actually found some great exhibitor families. Quite frankly, some of the best stalling I know at some fairs goes to families that they know will be great representatives for agriculture. Mm-hmm. Because that's something we have to look at from a public facing front.
You bet. Okay, let's take another break here, guys. When we come back, I want to get into one more thing that is a pressure point, and that's going to be, and I think now we can probably all agree on the next part of it a little bit, and that would be looking at just the support from local and our state governments would be, I think, is a challenge out there that we're starting to see some of that fade. I want to talk about that when we come back. This segment today brought to you by Mansaver Post Driver by Rohr Manufacturing, the portable, lightweight, and easy-to-use pneumatic post driver where the name speaks for itself. When it comes to building fence, driving those steel posts can be exhausting and absolutely backbreaking. But there is another way you could be doing this. Now, I'm not talking about those bulky and expensive gas-powered or hydraulic pounders. What I'm talking about is the Man Saver Post Driver. Yeah, it's called the Man Saver Post Driver by Roar Manufacturing. This is a portable, lightweight, easy-to-use post driver that runs off of any small air compressor and is 100% made in the USA. The Man Saver Post Driver comes in a variety of models, from driving posts ranging from vineyard stakes to T-posts and all the way up to 3.5-inch diameter posts. While it may be called the Man Saver Post Driver, shoot, I've heard some go as far as calling it the Marriage Saver Post Driver. But take a look for yourself. See it in action when you go to their website at roarmfg.com. That's ROHRERMFG.com. Or if you want to talk to a real person, give them a call at 800-980-7599. The Man Saver Post Driver, the portable, lightweight, and easy-to-use pneumatic post driver where the name speaks for itself. All right, guys, let's go down one more road here of things that I think have been some pressure points or growing. I think this next one is more of a growing pressure point, and it ties a little bit into our last conversation that we had as we continue to see our society further and further removed from production agriculture, because part of that society are the people that are in local and state government. And those are the ones then signing off or advocating or not advocating for county fairs, state fairs, or the facilities and all of that whole thing that kind of goes hand in hand with some of that. Taylor, I want to go to you on this. And I know you had mentioned that as a nonprofit, State Fair of Texas is a 501c3, so you're not as reliant on that. However, you're reliant on support in some aspects of it. So what do you see with that? I know, again, this is going to be where maybe state fairs and county fairs really see a little bit of separation in there, but the support that is starting to degenerate for these kind of events, we're starting to see it get a little bit more and more. And that's a concern to me.
Definitely. It's a piece of our jobs, whether we like it or not. We've got to have those friends down in Austin. And so we work very closely with a couple lobbyists and the officials down there to make sure that we're on the same page ultimately, because our job here is to celebrate all things Texan. We consider ourselves the most Texan place on earth. And so we need their support at the end of the day. And I mean, it has gotten challenging with us trying to make decisions that we feel are best for our fair and our event, and then receiving legal pushback, ultimately trying to step in and kind of undo those policies that we put in place. So it's been a huge piece of our jobs recently, but it's critical that we can work together with them to continue to be successful in the future.
Mm-hmm. Jeremy, I'll go to you with the same basic question.
Yeah, I think, again, in conversations with some county fairs across the state, I know Iowa right now, as in some states, some county governments are needing to cut back. And obviously one of the first things they're going to cut back might be the funding for their county fair. And so I know those fairs have really had to be more proactive. And I think that's at the same time the beauty of a fair. There's nothing more wholesome, nothing more American than a county fair, a place where 4-H and FFA kids can learn, a safe place where families can gather. I mean, if I'm a politician, that's where I'd want to put my money. And so I think ultimately sometimes, though, it is more incumbent upon the fairs to make sure that they are doing a good job telling their story. And I think a big problem in our industry is the fact that we just don't like to tell our story. I don't know if it's because a humility thing or what it is, but we really need to make sure those local political figures are well aware of what the fair is doing for their community and for their youth.
Mm-hmm. In this vein of conversation, because many of the, especially county fairs, are funded by their local county, it can become a point in the fairs where there's a lot of contention, and that contention then brings, I'm talking about just because it's parents and, with kids, and you guys know what I'm getting at in this point. So that contention begins to just be a festering issue within the community. And at some point then, you got county commissioners saying, I'm tired of dealing with this kind of stuff. And so they start to lose support that way. I see sometimes that being and I'm not really saying that so much on the state fair side, but definitely county fair side. That's one element that I see kind of going against these in getting support from the local and the county governments. Jeremy, your thoughts? I mean, you were a county fair manager prior to this, but just that we're looking at ourselves and trying to be, introspective as an industry and saying, okay, we're kind of doing some of this to ourselves, aren't we?
Yeah, a little bit of show ring politics then enters into, real politics, I guess you could say a little bit. And so, yeah, again, I think it's important. I think every organization is this way, that the only way you're going to combat that is you just really have to work to get everyone on the same page. Taylor mentioned about the most Texan place on earth. One of the things I know that is well known in the fair industry is there probably is not a more mission oriented fair than the State Fair of Texas. They understand why they exist. And so I think even the smallest county fair has to have some similar conversations of making sure, are we here for the fair, or are we just here because my grandkid is in the steer show? Are we here for the fair, or are we just here because of this or that? And what happens, as you mentioned, Justin, is when there is not that clear sense of mission, then it becomes really easy to be picked on, for lack of a better word. You're not providing that united front. And that's any size fair, I think, so whatever fairs can do to kind of resolve some of those issues to present this united front is just so important. There are so many things in today's world to distract people, and you really have to stay focused on what you're doing.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more, Jeremy, and thank you for that compliment. Yeah. I mean, it definitely did not happen overnight, but it was something that when Mitchell Gleber, our president, started, he felt very strongly about putting us on the map as a mission-focused organization, because we always were, but we never talked about it. We did an economic impact study recently, and we bring nearly $600 million of economic impact to the North Texas area. If we're not talking about those things, how can we expect to stay relevant and important to them? And especially you can dial that down then to the county level. And if they're not talking about the impact they're having, and again, it doesn't have to be financially huge, you can find other ways to share your impact and what you're doing, then how can they expect to remain relevant or top of mind for those officials?
Yep. Good point. And very good point to bring that up, Jeremy. And the mission, I think that's something and I wrote that down here. I thought if there's a takeaway for people listening, if they're representative of a county fair, is to, maybe step back and say, what is our mission? What is our goal? Because I think so much, especially many of these county fairs are volunteer basis. I mean, that's all it is. It's a volunteer deal. And so it's hard then to have that organization enough to, step back and say, okay, really, what is our mission?
And, going a step further with that, Justin, volunteers are what make fairs happen. But yet, I think sometimes back to this mission focus, you have to ask yourself, would I volunteer for us? A local county fair board or any organization that's dysfunctional and there's a lot of infighting. I mean, who really would want to volunteer for that? And I think sometimes there's that same thing. We have to step back, and I use that example again, that mom pushing her kid through the barn that's in the way because we're trying to get ready to go to the show ring. She's just there to learn. That really should be that mission, that you're looking at. And sometimes, though, I think we are our own worst enemies that way, too. We are not attractive places that a person would want to volunteer. So.
Okay, I'm going to take about a 90-degree turn here and talk on just something different because we got just a little bit of short time in this segment, because I want to continue in our last segment, talk about the future, how we move forward, what can we learn, and what are some steps moving forward in this for not only the fair industry, but for us as an agriculture industry that believes in fairs telling our story. So, all right, where I want to go now is facilities. And that is that, so many years ago, a lot of these venues were built. A lot of them, it's been hard to keep them updated. And now we see a different styles. We have some county fairs that are just, all they do is they're in charge of the county fair and that's it. And we got some county fair boards that are in charge of fair and the facilities. So it's a mix out there. I realize that, but the facility side of things for those that have to run facilities, that is a whole nother, that's an element that I think, and it goes back to the budget side of things, that's been tough, that's created more challenge. Taylor, I want to go to you on this question, and just from that perspective and that throwing that out there, that element is a struggle, and it's becoming tougher to get those monies set aside because, again, we're further and further removed from agriculture, and we got a facility that sits up there. Is it only being used 6, 7, 8 times out of the year, or are we going to get more use out of it? That's tough.
Yeah, great question. We definitely struggle with that here too, being 277 acres with so many buildings and facilities. We're actually one of the largest collections of Art Deco buildings in North America. And as you can imagine, these buildings were never meant to last this long. And so we have this interesting dynamic too, where we don't own the fairgrounds. The State Fair is just a tenant, just like any of the other museums out here. And so it's actually the city of Dallas that is then ultimately responsible for the upkeep and maintenance of those buildings. But that's again where there's some of that relationship building that we have to be sure we're staying on top of, because ultimately it affects us.
Yeah. Jeremy, your thoughts?
Yeah, here at the Iowa State Fair, we've been here since 1886, and 30 years ago, the Blue Ribbon Foundation was launched, arguably the most successful kind of fair fundraising organization in the United States. They've raised more than $200 million in the last 30 years to really restore the Iowa State Fairgrounds. But to your point, whether it's the Iowa State Fairgrounds or State Fair of Texas or a county fairgrounds, most of us are in facilities that are old and, as Taylor mentioned, not designed to. I'd love to ask some of the people that put these buildings up here at the Iowa State Fair in around the turn of the last century, like 1900, how long they thought that building was going to last, because we're still cleaning it out and using it every year. And I know that's true a lot of different places. And so I think fairs are going to have to be creative. I think those are places where it appears in our society today, government isn't going to be funding some of those type of projects. So how do you create a business model that will still allow you to put on your annual fair, but yet still maintain and upkeep the facility throughout the year? It's a challenge.
Yeah, for sure. It really is. Okay, guys, one more break. When we come back, I want to address basically two things. We need to know what we as an industry need to do. And then also, if there's folks county fair-wise, state fair-wise listening, what they need to be anticipating if they were to move forward as well. So that's the two sides we're going to go to when we come back here. This segment today brought to you by Rio Max, the tub that pays for itself.
We've done a few manure studies on the Rio Max product. On average, we're seeing 51% less undigested feed in cows' manure that have been on Rio Max. She's digesting her feed that much better and getting that much more protein and that much more energy out of her feed stock.
Generally figure about 5.5 to 6 acres a pair. Through the drought of 2020, we did 4.5 acres a pair on ours, still had adequate grass left.
I guess they utilize more of what they eat, so they eat less.
We were actually able to increase the number of cattle that we were running probably by 30%. With the same amount of grass.
We had a worse drought this year, worse heat this year. Weaned them a whole month earlier. They weighed at least 100 to 150 pounds more this year, and my cows had pones on them. The only thing different is the Rio Max tub.
Rio Max, the tub that pays for itself.
To learn more, call 888-386-0699 or online at riomax.net. Okay, guys, as our last segment here to do this, and we're going to approach this from two different things. I want to first, from your guys' perspective, as if you were standing in front of your peers and you said, okay, here's where we need to be. This is where we need to be going as a fair industry, whether you're county fair, whether you're state fair. Here's how we need to be thinking. Here's what we need to do as we look ahead for the next X amount of years. Taylor, I'll start with you. Jeremy, you'll follow up.
I think the biggest piece of advice I would give is to meet people where they are. So listen to what the people are loving about our fair and try and do more of that. Ultimately, we always want to have agriculture at our heart. So continuing to keep the traditions, but also be innovative, because if we don't change, then we're just going to be left behind. And so I think really listening to your audience, your fairgoers, is going to be the most important thing you could do.
Okay. Jeremy, your thoughts?
Yeah, jumping on what Taylor said there, I think really doubling down on that mission of agriculture. It's the agriculture piece that separates a fair from any other type of live entertainment, a festival, whatever it is. Agriculture is what sets a fair apart. So doubling down on that. And I think the other thing, and I know that this is something I challenge myself with all the time, people tell us, and there's a huge industry now within the fair industry just on food. mean, people tell us here at the Iowa State Fair, I know it's the same thing in Texas. I know it's the same thing in Minnesota. Number one reason people attend the fair is food. Well, food is agriculture. How do we connect that? How do we connect that food to what's going on in the livestock barns? I think somebody that can really figure that out is really going to revolutionize kind of our industry a little bit, because that's, in my mind, we have people there for food, which is agriculture, but we just aren't always connecting that dot the best, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Taylor, what's your frustration that you see in the fair industry of what's holding that you're just like, man, they just need to quit doing that?
Good question. I don't know if anything comes to mind immediately of like what they need to quit doing, but something I would highly recommend that folks take every opportunity is anytime you have a media relations opportunity that you're taking that to tell your story. At the end of the day, I know it can be challenging, especially in agriculture, when you've got a camera in a kid's face and the animal's face, and there are things that we just aren't necessarily TV friendly, but at the end of the day, let your communications team or media relations team or whoever it is help tell that story in a way that benefits the overall organization and ultimately the mission, and sharing about agriculture, because that's how you're going to continue touching so many different lives of people who never even thought to come to the fair because they're like, I don't care about the food, I don't care about the agriculture. But then suddenly they see this story on TV of this kid who has been working for the entire year to raise their animal, and that they're fifth generation and whatever the story may be. But then that really speaks to them. And you know what? Next year they're at that fair and they're walking through those livestock barns and they're enjoying a corny dog at Big Tex. And so I think taking any opportunity you can, even though I know that it can make it harder, is going to be a huge benefit.
Yeah. Jeremy, I'm going to ask you the same question, because we got folks listening that have everything from a 3-day fair to a 14-day fair. And as you've been in the industry for your tenure of being both in county fair and in state fair, and I know there's probably something you're like, okay, you guys got to get past this if we're going to go to the next level. Your thoughts?
I think, unfortunately, as I've seen many fairs, it's really internal. It goes back to a little bit what Taylor's talking about. Tell the story, but yet you first have to know what your story is. What is your mission? And so, sometimes it's dysfunctional boards. It's different situations like that sometimes are really holding the fairs back. And so that's fairs. I think that's really any nonprofit. That's a lot of different things. But, it really is making sure everybody is on the same page and moving in the same direction. That's going to create that mission. That's then going to create a story that's worth telling. But, sometimes I think we get in our own way by either being too shy or just being, quite frankly, dysfunctional.
Yeah. Okay, now let's go to the other side of this, and that is what, for us as an agricultural industry, and we've already talked a little bit, we've touched here bits and pieces here as we've talked about the different challenges that that the fairs industry would have. But as we look ahead, as an agriculture industry, what do we need to do? How do we need to step up to protect our county and our state fairs and continue to see them functioning and moving forward in the vein that they're out there to be the educational component to what we do in our lifestyle? Taylor, again, I'll go with you first on this, but what your thoughts as we go forward?
I think it's simple. We've talked about it a few times here, but to continue being open-minded and welcoming people who aren't in that space. They're just that divide. We've got to start getting closer to coming together and understanding what it is that the livestock and agriculture industry really is. And if somebody has no experience on that, you need someone who does, to then welcome them in and explain it to them so that they can feel like they can use their expertise to potentially be mutually beneficial. And so I think just having conversations, being open to sharing what y'all do in this space will go so far.
Mm-hmm. Jeremy, same question to you.
Yeah, there are many, many people that would not step foot on someone's farm or ranch, but they will step foot on a fairgrounds. And so I think ultimately it really is determining what story does agriculture want to tell. We're bringing the people in, what does that story look like? And I know there are some tremendous ways to do that through, local commodity groups and state organizations. But, the fair is providing that platform The fair is providing that platform for people to gather. So what can we tell them? And I think you really focused on ultimately even those livestock projects at their core are youth development projects. They're teaching kids responsibility. And those, I think, those are the stories that also need to get out. This understanding of, the elected official may not care that there was a record sold at the livestock auction, but that elected official would care that you're developing youth and these kids are staying out of trouble and they're becoming model productive citizens. And that's, I think, somewhat what we need to look at for sure. And a vein of that is almost every fair, large or small, usually has some sort of scholarship component. Somehow they're raising money. I know here at the Iowa State Fair, that Sale of Champions auction, when we sell those animals, that's all to raise money for scholarships. So although it may not be great from an ag perspective, perhaps the focus needs to be on that end result, that scholarship that is maybe bringing a vet back to your local community or bringing an ag teacher back to your local small town. That's really the success of the fair.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna go dark here for just one more question to both of you, and we can't spend a lot of time answering it, but just a quick thought. What does our society look like without a county or a state fair? Taylor.
Not a society I want to be a part of. Mm-hmm. Quite frankly, I think that we are the heart of the year. People look forward to this tradition, whether it be, again, to come and show at the fair or to simply attend it and try some crazy food. People are coming out here and making memories. And I think that this is one of the few places left that you can come and leave all the noise at the gates and not have to think about all of the hard things going on, all of the sad news that you see, and just have fun. So I think we are critical to society and just the happiness of it.
Jeremy, the same question to you. What do you feel our society would look like without our county fairs and our state fairs?
Well, echoing everything Taylor said, fairs are a safe place for families to gather. All generations can come to a fair and find something to interest them. So if there's no fair, that's one less opportunities for family to spend time together. I think you are only deepening the divide between urban and rural without a fair. Again, as I said, there are people that would never step foot on a farm that will step foot on a fairgrounds. And at least that is a step towards agriculture that you wouldn't have without a fair.
Very good. Well, Taylor, Jeremy, to both of you, thank you for taking the time to do this. I appreciate your perspective on this. I know for our regular listeners to the Working Ranch Radio Show, it's a topic that's kind of out of the normal vein of production agriculture, but I think it's one of our things too. It gets back to us as agriculture not always doing a great job of telling our story. And that's what you guys are saying from the very beginning. The fairs are a component of sharing our story. And so I appreciate your guys' perspective on this. Again, thanks for joining us here today on the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You bet. And again, our guest today, Jeremy Parsons, CEO and manager of the Iowa State Fair. Of course, their event's coming up here right around the corner, August 7th through the 17th. And Taylor Pulfer with the State Fair of Texas also joining us. Their event coming up September 26th through October 19th. And as I think about our conversation here today, as we understand the role of that, and without our county and our state fairs, it just widens that gap between our society, people understanding where their food comes from, and us as farmers and ranchers all across the country that are trying to provide the food and fiber for a country so that we can be secure in our food supply. And I think that is so, so important that we understand that it really does start at this level. And we, as an agricultural community, stand behind our county and our state fairs and push back on our county and local and state governments that want to continue to defund these kind of events, these wholesome activities, wholesome events that are going on. Yes, I realize there's probably some element of dysfunction in some of it, but let's just not throw the baby out with the bathwater, for lack of better words, and let's see what we can do to continue to strengthen our county and our state fair system. Speaking of that, you know who else is very supportive of our county and our state fairs? That is our President of the United States, President Trump, launching back on the 4th of July. In fact, Jeremy Jeremy was able to be a part of this deal. It was the Great American State Fair, launched July 4th at the Iowa State Fairgrounds. And for the next year, you're going to see many of our state fairs, as well as some of our county fairs, initiating President Trump's Great American State Fair initiative that's going to be taking place for the next year as we celebrate America's 250th birthday. Stay with us. We're going to take a look at our weather coming up next.
Fascinated by our wild weather? Now you can learn, appreciate, and understand the weather in your own backyard with the new Tropo Rain Gauge. Having achieved the highest rating of any product reviewed by the weatherstationexperts.com, the Tropo boasts rugged durability, impeccable accuracy, and precision to the 100th of an inch. Visit measurerain.com to order a Tropo today and use code RAINDAY. That's RAINDAY for free shipping and 10% off. Go to measurerain.com.
And joining us now with a look at our long-term weather is meteorologist Don Day. And Don, as you and I were talking before we started on air here this morning, it's kind of a little bit of an odd weather pattern this summer that we're seeing, mainly for our part of the country, but I think in other parts as well. And as we head into August now, we're going to be through most of the summer, and for parts of the country, they really haven't seen that hot weather. And I kind of knock on wood when I say that, though.
Well, yeah, if you were to examine the central and western United States, especially, let's say, from the western Corn Belt all the way to the West Coast, it's been an unremarkable summer with temperatures in terms of no consistently hot weather. Yeah, there's been hot days, but we haven't put together what I would call a heat wave. Parts of California have had the coolest summer to date since 1965. That includes part of the Pacific Northwest. And, even into the desert states in the Great Basin, the temperatures have just been unremarkable. And that includes the Northern Plains. Yes, we've had heat, especially in the Southeast, parts of the Great Lakes and the East Coast, which has made plenty of headlines. But overall, a lot of the nation's summer has fallen well short of. There were several predictions of a very hot, prolonged heat this summer. Those predictions are not going to come to fruition.
Yeah. So as we look into this first part of August, starting to see some Canadian fronts or some Canadian weather really impacting our weather across the country.
Yeah, and we've had a very active northern jet stream. It's been very busy across the North Pacific, not allowing any persistent high pressure ridge to really set up and give us that prolonged heat. And so this is something that we're going to watch here as we get to the end of August and into early September, because this type of pattern has lent itself before to September and October that can send some colder weather into the lower 48. Doesn't necessarily mean that I'm saying it's going to be an early winter, but what we do see is that once we get past the second half of August into early September, we, believe it or not, we are getting into that time of year where fall patterns start to show themselves.
So with the Midwest, I know earlier in the summer, it was kind of a little drier up in the northern tier of the Midwest. That has changed a little bit. What does it look like for them going into August?
They're going to still stay wet. It is still looking wet for Nebraska, the Dakotas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, the northern and western Corn Belt. And the reason for that is this feed of subtropical moisture, at least through the first half of the month, will pretty much continue unabated. And I know there's some folks in those areas who would like maybe a week or so of a break from the rain, but it doesn't look like that's going to happen. So for those northern, northwest Corn Belt, northern plain areas, continue to expect frequent thunderstorms and more wetness.
Okay. The southern plains has been a lot of weather early on in the spring and throughout this summer. Of course, now we're kind of starting to talk a little bit more and have heard more about some tropical storms. How does that look as we head into August?
Be ready for that tropical storm activity to pick up, especially across the southeastern United States, the Gulf. We're getting some pretty strong signals, big picture signals in both the Atlantic and the Pacific that tend to be precursors to the development of tropical activity to ramp up. Now, climatologically speaking, this is exactly when we expect it. August, September into early October is peak tropical storm hurricane season. And I think that's exactly what we're going to see as we get further into August. We'll be talking about that. So the East Coast and the Southeast United States needs to raise their awareness because it's coming.
Okay. All right, Don. Well, I appreciate the update. Look forward to talking to you next week.
See you then.
And that is meteorologist Don Day with a look at our long-term weather. If you want to tune in each and every morning to follow along with him as to what he is seeing for weather across the country, you can find a link to his YouTube channel by going to his website at dayweather.com. That's going to do it for this week's edition of the Working Ranch Radio Show, which is a production of Working Ranch Magazine, branded #1 by America's Ranchers. Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to tune in next week, same time, same place. I'm Justin Mills, and until next time, keep your chin down and your mind in the middle. So long.